One day I went to my mailbox and I got out a little flyer and it said, we're inviting you to a meeting with Ben Rich, the chairman and CEO of Lockheed Skunk Works, former UCLA alumni. He'll be speaking to the engineering alumni group about his time at the Skunk Works. So as he was finishing his talk after about 45 minutes, his last slide was a black disc zipping off in outer space. And he ended the talk by saying, we now have the technology to take ET home. And the whole room burst out laughing. We said, did he just say that? And as he was walking away, I followed him and I said, Ben. He turned around and looked at me and I said, Ben, I'm really fascinated with what you had to say today. And I said, I would really love to know how we would do that. What would we use to get to the stars? He looked at me, trying to figure out who I was, I think. And he said, well, let me ask you a question. How does ESP work? And I was really taken back because frankly, I was asking a question. I wasn't expecting to get a question back. So the first thing that popped in my mind was all points in space and time are connected. So I fired that answer back to him. I don't know, all points in space and time are connected. He said, that's how it works. He turned around and he walked away.
This astonishing admission from a top military industrial complex insider proves to be much more than a simple analogy. The physics of UFOs, how they travel and communicate through interstellar distances, how they generate power, how they're manufactured, is beyond the grasp of unclassified mainstream science. Instead, a model of reality that accounts for ESP is the only model in which we can begin to comprehend ET technology.
If you're traveling beyond the speed of light, I call it the crossing point of light. It's like this beyond the sound barrier. Well, there's something beyond the light barrier. And you're going from, say, the Andromeda galaxy. That's 2.5 million light years away. So at the speed of light, it would take 2.5 million years for them to get here. The speed of light's too slow. You cannot go from point A to B through the cosmos through a linear system of transportation. Moreover, you cannot communicate through those distances with something at the speed of light, which is what your cell phone and all these radio frequency electromagnetic communication devices we use now on Earth are using. Any civilization that is here, that is interstellar, by definition, is transdimensional. They're passing through other dimensions and dropping out of linearity and going from A to B, boom, almost like a teleportation where it's that resonant effect from point A to B. Any communications systems that these ETs have are also going at the speed of not light, but of thought, a quanta of thought. We think of consciousness and thought as this sort of amorphous, irrelevant, interesting, but mystical thing. But the central operating system and communication system for all interstellar civilizations is consciousness and thought, and technologies that interface with them.
God, prana, chi, magic, consciousness. Every culture throughout history has had a word to describe this intangible energy that connects everyone and everything. Decades of laboratory studies show that our minds have a mysterious ordering effect on quantum-level phenomena. Despite overwhelming scientific evidence, most people would still be shocked to learn that certain scientists have known that the force is real for a very long time.
One of the people that I met in the course of doing this work was astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who was the sixth man to walk on the moon.
We have sightings of all sorts. There seems to have been a great deal of secrecy surrounding the so-called UFO event.
He had an experience in space, an expanded state of consciousness that led him to form the Institute of Noetic Sciences to study the science of consciousness. I also brought him to the briefing I did in 1997 with the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Tom Wilson. The data on that has since leaked out. Edgar Mitchell realized there was this connection between space and these extraterrestrial life forms and the science of consciousness that was very integral to the study. Most of the people that I have met with in senior science, NASA, aerospace, and intelligence community figures know that the key missing ingredient out of most people's understanding of the whole UFO phenomenon is the science of consciousness. The ETs are trying to encourage people to understand higher consciousness and universal mind. to be able to have a relationship with them that's going forward into the future. And Edgar Mitchell realized that quite early on because of his own personal experience out in space as the sixth man to walk on the moon.
What's the nature of the universe we live in? What is our relationship to the larger reality? If that's a part of the larger reality and we're denying it, that to me is unconscionable.
I theorize that there is a spectrum of consciousness available to human beings. At one end is material consciousness. At the other end is what we call field consciousness, where a person is at one with the universe, perceiving the universe. Just by looking at our planet on the way back, I saw or felt a field consciousness state. Dr. Edgar Mitchell.
We've thought for a long time that the closer we could look at the operations of cells in our body and our brains, the closer we'd come to finding the location of consciousness. And while there's been fantastic work at mapping neural connections and understanding more and more about the brain and memory, what we find is that we still don't know where consciousness is.
Adam Michael Curry is an inventor and entrepreneur whose groundbreaking work as a teenager caught the eye of Princeton's Dean of Engineering, Dr. Robert John. Dr. John recruited Adam into the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, where they studied the mysterious ordering effect of consciousness on quantum systems, an effect they called mind-matter interaction.
Now, a non-localized picture is the picture of consciousness on which we're converging now, which is to say that consciousness does not seem to be strictly produced by the brain. It involves the brain, but there's something much deeper going on here. Consciousness may not be localized to our bodies, but may be a fundamental feature of the physical world in which we live.
The universe looks less like a big machine than a big thought. Dr. Dean Radin, Chief Scientist, Institute of Noetic Sciences.
Consciousness, this faculty of being sentient, awake, is not limited to our brain waves or our bodies, but in fact transcends the limits of space-time. It's an unbounded field of awareness. And that is true whether you recognize it or not. Interestingly, it doesn't matter if you intellectualize it. That is the reality of it that has been proven through scientific studies, such as Dr. John's work at Princeton, where they would have people put their awareness on a random number generator that's spitting out zeros and ones randomly, and would intend to shift it, say, towards zeros, and it would shift without any linear wires, just their thought.
Essentially what a random number generator does is it looks at something intrinsically random in the physical world, typically a quantum process, and it converts those into a string of ones and zeros. So you can think of it kind of like a coin flipper where heads is 1 and tails is 0. Now if you collect a large enough sample size, you find a 50-50 distribution of these ones and zeros, meaning physical reality is behaving the way it should. Well, if you get somebody in front of the machine and you ask them to use their intention to mean shift the thing to more ones or more zeros, what you find is that there's, not all the time, but often a significant mean shift in the direction of their intention. Now that's a very simple experiment, but the implications are absolutely profound. That suggests that, in fact, consciousness does not seem to be just an illusion or just a localized phenomenon, but that it does have some sort of capabilities to affect the probabilities at the deepest layer of reality, down in the basement layer of the quantum world somehow.
In this flow, mind and matter are not separate substances. Rather, they are different aspects of one whole and unbroken movement. Dr. David Bohm, physicist.
The best way to understand non-locality is to understand that in both physics and in consciousness, there is a connection that exists amongst all things, from photons to people to awareness, that isn't limited by space and time per se, that are woven within each other. Dr. Emoto, the Japanese scientist, began to experiment with water and people putting their intent on the water. And he did photography that would show these different crystalline structures. If it was a very negative emotion, the crystals would be all dissonant. But when it was highly ordered conscious or love, the structures were these beautiful ordered structures that he would photograph. And this was repeated by other scientists. Water has a crystalline component, but it's also tied into, like all matter in space and time in the universe, to this consciousness force field. If you enter into just a quiet state of consciousness and intend something very positive, it literally altered the structure of the water itself.
Non-locality is au courant with modern physics. Schrödinger talked about non-locality and entanglement in the 1920s, but it really wasn't until 1970 that Friedman and Clauser at Berkeley discovered that photons born together like identical twins can move off into the distance from one another, and you grab one twin and you change the polarization of the other, even though they're very, very far apart. And the lingo describing this in modern physics is, we would say, they're entangled with one another.
There was an unpublished experiment that we did at the Pear Lab, which we called plant RNG. You have a room with no windows, and you have a house plant that needs light to grow. You have a single growing light up on the roof. The growing light can turn in one of 4 quadrants, and which quadrant that light is showing is controlled by a random number generator. So you put the plant in one corner of the room. The light has an equal chance of shining in all 4 quadrants. But you give it enough time, and what you find is the light actually shines far more often on the plant than on the other coordinates. It's as though life itself, even life or consciousness in something as simple as a houseplant, bends probabilities in the physical world in the direction of what it needs, in the direction of its growth and its evolution. I see that experiment as profound because it shows to me what consciousness does in the world.
How could ESP work? Does ESP violate any physics? First of all, you can't violate the laws of physics, not like going through a stop sign. If you have a phenomenon, physics has to change to agree with your phenomena.